son. Hide him aboard.
Aye, aye, sir.
Fire, dress ship.
Very good, sir. Dress ship!
A Brief History of Man's Maritime Mastery. Chapter 9. The World Circumnavigated. Vasco Núñez de Balboa, Spanish explorer, governor, and conquistador, had climbed a peak in Panama and glimpsed the vast expanse of the South Sea, while Portuguese explorers in the Orient had navigated its western edges. But what lay between these distant horizons? European mapmakers were baffled, yet they clung to one belief: the ocean was likely narrow. This thought fortified Ferdinand Magellan as he prepared for his daring mission in Seville. Commissioned by Spain, this Portuguese navigator was tasked with crossing the unknown ocean after finding a way around the Americas. Magellan believed that just as Africa tapered eastward toward its cape, South America must taper westward to a similar point. Somewhere there had to be a passage, an outlet that would lead to the riches of the Moluccas. Once found, trade would flourish, and Spain's coffers would swell, rivaling those of Portugal. By September 20th, 1519, Magellan's fleet of 5 small ships, Trinidad, San Antonio, Concepcion, Victoria, and Santiago, was provisioned and ready to embark from Sanlúcar. The captains inspected their vessels for stowaway wives and other contraband. Then, with a thunderous salute from their cannons, they set out on one of the boldest voyages in the history of the sea. The fleet sailed steadily down the North Atlantic, bound for Brazil. The pilots lost sight of the North Star and instead began navigating by the Southern Cross. Antonio Pigafetta, a Venetian chronicler, meticulously recorded their journey, providing a primary account of the expedition. Nearly 3 months after their departure, the ships anchored in what is now Rio de Janeiro. The crews reveled in the abundance of the land, feasting on fowl, tapir, sweet potatoes, and pineapples, while trading amicably with the local Indians. But Magellan was mindful of the papal decree that had granted Portugal dominion over Brazil. Fearing an attack, he urged his fleet southward, ever searching for that elusive strait that would lead them to the great South Sea. At the vast estuary of Rio de la Plata, Magellan thought he had found his passage. A high point of land inspired the cry of Montevideo, or "I see a mountain," thus christening a future city. But the broad expanse of water was merely a river, and the fleet pressed on. As they ventured further south, icy winds swept up from the Antarctic, chilling the men to their bones. Frostbite gnawed at the crew until Magellan found refuge in a sheltered bay where they could winter. There the men hunted strange geese and sea wolves, penguins and seals, curing the meat for sustenance. Gigantic natives appeared, and Pigafetta observed their curious customs, noting that they ate rats without skinning them. Magellan dubbed these towering people Patagones, or Big Feet, a name that would forever mark the region as Patagonia. Throughout the bitter winter, Magellan faced mutiny. He outwitted the would-be rebels, executing 3 and marooning 2 more. But the harsh conditions continued to test the fleet. When the Santiago was sent southward to reconnoiter, a sudden squall smashed her against the shore. Though the crew survived, they had to rejoin the now dwindling fleet of 4 ships. In October 1520, a spring breathed new life into the land, and the lookouts spotted what seemed to be a bay. It was the strait they had been searching for. Magellan convened with his officers, all of whom were determined to press on. But the pilot of the San Antonio, the largest ship, turned back, abandoning the quest. Undeterred, Magellan swore to the others, "Even if we have to eat the leather wrappings on the masts and yards, I will go on." Cautiously, the 3 remaining vessels navigated through the strait's treacherous waters, battling fierce currents and towering 40-foot tides. Along the southern shore, Indian fires flickered in the distance, prompting Magellan to name the land Tierra del Fuego, or Land of Fire. It took a grueling month to thread their way through the stormy passage that would forever bear Magellan's name. But at last they emerged into the vast, open expanse of the great South Sea. The waters, calm and sunlit after the perils of the strait, inspired the explorers to christen this newfound ocean the Pacific. Their spirits buoyed. The men sailed up the coast of what is now Chile and headed west into the vast emptiness of the Pacific Ocean. Magellan eagerly awaited the lookout's cry. The Moluccas, the Spice Islands of the East Indies, were in view. But the weeks dragged on. The smoked penguins they had stored began to spoil. The biscuits turned into powder and crawled with worms, and the drinking water grew yellow and alive with parasites. The men pinched their noses to choke it down. Scurvy set in, ravaging the crew as weaker men sought shade from the relentless sun. 2 months into their journey, they found a tiny atoll, now called Puka Puka, or Dog Island, part of the Tuamotu group of islands. The crew caught fish and seabirds and trapped rainwater in their sails, but there were no fruits or vegetables. Scurvy continued its relentless assault, covering the men's bodies with sores. Their teeth loosened in their swollen gums and fell out, while black blood oozed from their wounds. Moving their aching joints brought shrieks of pain. As the ships pressed on, hunger and disease took an ever greater toll. Only a handful of sailors remained capable of working the gear. A single gale could have destroyed them all. Desperate for nourishment, Magellan ground up maggots for the scant nutrition they offered. Rats became so precious they fetched half a year's pay. In grim fulfillment of their leader's vow, the men dragged the ship's leather parts astern to soften them, then pulverized the material and boiled it to a thin broth. By March 5th, 1521, the fleet was nearly helpless, the crew absolutely out of food. At dawn the next morning, a lookout spotted a distant mountain. Parched and weak, he wet his cracked lips and tried to cry out, but could only manage a pitiful croak. Finally, he shrieked with all his remaining strength, "Praise God! Praise God! Land, land, land!" and burst into tears. This land was Guam. Islanders swarmed out to meet them in swift prows, and promptly stole a skiff from under the Trinidad's stern. Climbing aboard the ships like monkeys, they took everything not nailed down. A haughty chief even knocked down 2 decrepit sailors. The Spaniards struggled to their crossbows, and one buried an arrow in the chief's chest. The chief, with a look of surprise, pulled out the crimson shaft and examined it curiously before collapsing. After firing broadsides, Magellan's men landed, dispersed the villagers, and recovered the stolen skiff. They then gorged on long figs, which were actually bananas, drank the refreshing milk of coconuts, and chewed on some delicious sugar cane. They named the archipelago the Ladrones, meaning thieves, a name that persists for the Mariana Islands to this day. Another week of sailing brought the explorers to the high island of Samar in the Philippines. Magellan had sailed this far east before while in the service of Portugal. Now he had reached the same meridian by sailing westward for Spain. He had circumnavigated the world. Behind him lay some 9,000 miles of this so-called narrow Pacific Ocean. The fleet threaded its ways through the forested lands off Leyte, passed through Surigao Strait, and anchored at the tiny island of Limasawa. Islanders hovered about in boats, but remained cautious, keeping their distance. Then a Malay slave that Magellan had acquired in the service of Portugal hailed them in his native tongue. They replied, and at that moment Magellan knew he had reached the Orient. The Spaniards, seeking to establish trust with these shy islanders, placed gifts on a plank and floated it toward them. After 2 days of this cautious diplomacy, the king himself came aboard. Magellan, ever the diplomat, gifted him a robe and a scarlet cap, and the two pledged brotherhood in a blood ritual, each pricking himself and tasting the other's blood. Pigafetta, the chronicler of the voyage, along with Magellan's Malay slave, were invited ashore as the king's honored guests. There, seated in state, they dined on a dish of pig's flesh, washing down each mouthful with wine. The fleet sailed on to the populous island of Cebu, where Magellan induced the king to swear fealty to the crown of Spain. In this moment of triumph, the explorer wept with joy, embracing the king and pledging eternal peace between Spain and Cebu. Overcome by the magnitude of his achievement, Magellan turned missionary, converting the king and triggering a rush of baptisms. The fleet's priest worked tirelessly, his arms barely able to lift in blessing. To this day, the Philippines remains Asia's only predominantly Christian nation. However, not all were eager to embrace the cross. On the nearby island of Mactan, a defiant chief refused conversion. Against the advice of his fellow officers, Magellan decided to coerce him. With about 50 followers, he landed on the shoals of Magellan. They were met by a howling horde that showered them with arrows, javelins, spears hardened in fire, and even mud. Though their armor protected most of their bodies, the Europeans were vulnerable in their legs. The warriors, skilled in battle, aimed low. After an inconclusive skirmish, most of the Europeans retreated to the boats offshore, but a handful stayed with Magellan. As the natives closed in, Magellan and his men fought them off in the water, inching their way toward the boats. Magellan managed to stab an assailant with his lance, but the weapon was wrenched from his grasp as the man fell. When he reached for his sword, he found he could not draw it, a javelin wound in his own arm rendering him too weak. Seeing his plight, the warriors concentrated their attack on him. One drove a spear with full force into Magellan's legs. He fell face forward into the water, and in an instant the mob threw themselves upon him, hacking him with their weapons. Pigafetta, who had fought beside him until the end, sorrowfully recorded the deaths of our mirror, light, comfort, and true guide. Magellan's death shattered the Europeans' prestige. A large party of Spaniards was lured ashore and slaughtered. Those who remained aboard, including Pigafetta, cut the anchor cables and fled. Yet the survivors still had enough determination to continue their quest for spices. Abandoning the leaky Concepcion, they traded at Borneo and finally found cloves in abundance at Tidore in the long-sought Moluccas. As the first loads came aboard, the crews fired a salute, for these spices were the chief object of their voyage. When the supply of barter goods ran out, the men traded their coats and shirts for even more cloves. By late December 1521, both vessels were overladen with spices. Then, the Trinidad fell prey to the Portuguese, leaving only the Victoria, commanded by Juan Sebastian del Cano, one of the mutinous officers from earlier in the voyage. By a twist of fate, the duty of holding the last ship together for the journey home now fell to him. Only 47 men remained out of the 275 who had left Spain. The worm-eaten ship and her emaciated crew fought storms and adverse currents as they crossed the Indian Ocean and coasted Africa, keeping far south of the Cape of Good Hope. Finally, Victoria limped around the Cape and set a course northward for the Atlantic. Once again, scurvy and starvation set in. Not until June did the ship struggle across the equator. By that time, there was a funeral every day. The last thing Del Cano wanted was to stop at the Cape Verde Islands and risk running into the Portuguese, but bitter necessity forced him to. He warned his men to say that they had come from America, but the secret leaked out. They had been trading in the Portuguese sphere of influence. Every sailor ashore was seized, and Del Cano had to weigh anchor quickly to save his ship. He had hardly enough hands left aboard to man it. On September 8th, 1522, Victoria finally bore 18 wretched survivors into Seville. Magellan's fame rang through Europe, for although the great feat did little to increase Spain's hopes of rich trade routes, it opened the eyes of questing men to the true dimensions of their home planet.